wine, make love.
But if you don't release her, you'll never see home again.
Mighty Achilles, silent.
I don't want to fight.
In certain war films, the army, maps, and orders are the starting points. However, the 2004 film Troy starts out differently. It starts out with human frailty and a seemingly private, even secret longing. But in the end it raises 1,000 ships, destroys kingdoms, and transforms people's names into mythology. This is a comprehensive review of the movie Troy, covering the entire plot in one in-depth analysis. Important details, the significance of the conclusion, the hero's fates, and the reasons why the tale of Achilles, Hector, Paris, Helen, and King Priam still has resonance as both an ancient myth and a breathtaking human tragedy. The most crucial aspect of this is that Wolfgang Petersen is not creating a museum adaptation of the Iliad. He nearly completely eliminates the gods, leaving only the most significant aspect of the narrative. Nobody can now evade Olympus's will. Zeus does not explain why one must die and another must live, nor does Athena direct the hand or Apollo determine the result. In this version, individuals make their own decisions about fear, glory, love, retaliation, and pride. After that, customers pay for the items they selected. In the world the movie depicts, kings are no longer just in charge. They seize territory, subjugate neighbors, form coalitions, violate oaths, and declare war. Although Greece is divided, Agamemnon, the king of Mycenae, wants to rule over everyone rather than find peace. He is not a hero, a romantic, or a shrewd unifier. His other strength is that he recognizes that war may be a useful tool rather than a last resort. It may be exaggerated if there is a reason. One can be found if there isn't one. Agamemnon and King Triopas' army engage in combat right from the start. The two sides are prepared for combat, but they use a champion duel to determine the result in order to prevent thousands of casualties. This scene is crucial because it exposes the logic of the world of Troy right away. Although the kings speak loudly about honor, and the armies are enormous, many people's fates are frequently determined by a single individual. Just one sword, just one blow, one name that makes others back off. Boagrius is a huge warrior from Triopas. He appears to have been made to break people with terror and weight rather than competence. Agamemnon also possesses Achilles. More accurately, Achilles does not resemble a king's soldier. Therefore Agamemnon only owns him in name. It is necessary to look for, wait for, and tolerate him. He comes across as a man who understands that this power is frequently powerless without him, rather than as a subservient instrument of authority. And the movie instantly establishes Achilles' mystique in his first appearance. He doesn't fight in a protracted heroic conflict. He doesn't demonstrate his might to the audience with a stunning sequence of blows. He leaps, dashes, and strikes Boagrius, but it all comes to an almost immediate conclusion. The army is silent, the giant collapses, and the legend comes to life. The hero in front of us is dangerous not because of his stature, but because of his accuracy. He kills so fast that it doesn't seem necessary to fight. However, it is evident following the triumph that Achilles does not celebrate Agamemnon's success. He hates the king he just assisted. They are not genuinely loyal to one another. There is a forced alliance. Achilles needs battle, since only war can grant him what he most desires, an immortal name, and Agamemnon wants the greatest warrior in Greece. Additionally, this is the movie's first significant fracture. Achilles does not envision a tranquil existence. He is aware that even the strongest hands will eventually turn to dust. That man is mortal, and that the body will eventually vanish. However, a name is more durable than bones. He is plagued by the fear of being forgotten other than the fear of dying. As a result, he is not content with his strength. He feels lonely as a result. He is rarely a part of the everyday world. He is used by kings. Warriors are afraid of him. Women see him as a legend, and he himself appears to hear the footsteps of his own death all the time. Another plotline in the movie starts in Sparta, while Agamemnon grows his influence in Greece. Paris and Hector, the Trojan princes, arrive there. The goal of their arrival is to firmly establish peace between Sparta and Troy. Hector is aware of the cost of peace. He is not weak nor naive, and he does not think that good words by themselves will put an end to more violence. However, he is aware that one must at least attempt to prevent war if it is possible. For him, honor is obligation to the city, the parent, the wife, the son, and the people who will perish if the princes make a mistake. Rather than lovely speeches, Paris is not like other places. He is more sensitive, kinder, and younger. He lives by heart rather than by state calculation. This has some attraction, but in the world of Troy, an unresponsible heart turns into a danger. Menelaus, the Spartan king's wife, has captured Paris's heart. Furthermore, this relationship is not shown in the movie as a whim. There is an emotion between them, a wish to escape the roles that have been thrust upon them, and the delusion that love and politics can coexist. However, this is the very reason their decision is risky. They believe they are choosing their own destiny. They are actually touching a wall that conceals an entire civilization. In the movie, Helen is more than just the most beautiful woman who initiated the war and a trophy. She's portrayed by Diane Kruger as someone who is fed up with becoming a symbol. She's a queen to Sparta, property and status proof for Menelaus, love and salvation for Paris. There's a reason for Greece, a risk for Troy, but in all of this, where is Helen? Even when it doesn't express it explicitly, the movie consistently raises this question. The worst blow comes to Hector rather than Menelaus when Paris abducts Helen on the Trojan ship, because Hector is the first to realize the extent of the catastrophe. When he meets Helen on the ship, he realizes that his brother has brought war, not a woman, home. It was feasible to go back at that point, give her back, and attempt to keep the peace deal intact. Paris, however, begs his brother. He talks about love, how it would be impossible to live without her, and how he can't handle being apart. Hector then makes a decision that will plague the whole movie. Despite his disapproval of Paris's behavior, he stands up for his brother. Even if he doesn't think it's proper, he doesn't give him over to the adversaries. This is where Hector's tragedy lies. Loyalty, not infallibility, is what gives him honor. Even though he frequently sees the repercussions more clearly than others, he yet maintains a close relationship with the people he is accountable to. His duty is his greatest asset, yet it is progressively turning into a trap. Menelaus's personal shame quickly escalates into a political tempest upon discovering that Helen has departed with Paris. He wants retribution. However, Agamemnon's motivation goes beyond simply exacting revenge on his brother. It's the ideal pretext. Troy is a wealthy and strong city that controls vital Aegean sea routes. Agamemnon's power is insufficient as long as Helen maintains her independence. The Greek rulers can join together under Helen's leadership. A military campaign develops from the love narrative. Here, the movie genuinely demonstrates that major conflicts seldom begin for a single cause. Yes, Helen was taken away by Paris. Yes, Menelaus wants to erase the disgrace and win his wife back. However, Agamemnon sees past personal issues. Troy is what he wants. He demands that the final significant free stronghold bow down to him. As a result, when he talks of his brother's honor, his desire for victory than familial suffering is what fires in his eyes. He needs Achilles for the battle against Troy. However, Achilles dislikes Agamemnon and does not wish to be a pawn in his scheme. The king of Ithaca, Odysseus, then approaches him. Instead than portraying Odysseus as a boisterous hero, Sean Bean portrays him as a shrewd negotiator who recognizes that using a sword is not the only way to end a conflict. Odysseus is able to communicate with Achilles. He doesn't attempt to convince him that his mission is noble. He uses the language of splendor to communicate with him. Achilles must make a decision: remain at home, live a long life, be at peace, possibly have a family, age quietly, and vanish from people's memories, or travel to Troy, where he will face a short route, blood, hatred, and death, but his name will live on for centuries after his passing. A discussion with his mother, Thetis, confirms this. She's portrayed in the movie as an almost spectral being connected to knowledge, fate, and the sea rather than a goddess in the traditional sense. She doesn't give her son orders. The price is opened by her. Achilles will survive if he remains. He will be exalted if he sets ship for Troy, but he could not return at all. And Achilles decides on Troy, not because he thinks Agamemnon is true, not because he despises Trojans, not because he wants to give Helen back to Menelaus. He decides to go to war because it offers him the only immortality that a man without gods can have. Remembrance. In the meantime, Troy encounters Paris and Helen as more than simply two fugitives. The city is strong, lovely, and full of individuals who are unsure of the cost of their return. Peter O'Toole's character, King Priam, greets Helen with extraordinary kindness. He doesn't seem like a blind idiot. He's elderly, aristocratic, devout, and associated with the concepts of fate and science. He believes in his city's glory and the gods' protection. However, he is also unable to view the situation objectively because of his love for his sons. Hector goes back to his son and his wife, Andromache, and war is no longer a lovely legend juxtaposed to this family scene, because we now realize that more than just the glory of heroes is at stake. The home, the child, and the mother who already senses the impending catastrophe are all at risk. For the audience, Hector transforms from simply being the best warrior of Troy to someone who desires to live, but is prepared to perish. The city requires it. The most significant difference between Achilles and Hector is this. Achilles fights for a reputation that will outlive him. For the sake of those who might survive his demise, Hector goes to battle. Songs are a way to find eternity. The other aims to save the house. Additionally, the movie portrays the impending confrontation as a clash between two meanings of life rather than just a fight between the two best warriors. Paris, however, is torn between love and its repercussions. Although he brought Helen to the city, he is powerless to stop what she will bring with her. He is sincere, yet maturity is not the same as sincerity. Even if he is prepared to pass away with poetic words, he is still unaware that other people's deaths will be more difficult than his own. This indicates that he is not merely a coward, as is commonly believed, but rather someone who mistook a romantic gesture for a genuine accountability. The movie becomes a magnificent epic spectacle. When the Greek ships depart for Troy, the sheer number of ships makes the sea seem almost metallic. This is more than an army. Agamemnon collected all of Greece's will under a single pretense. Menelaus desires Helen. The city is what Agamemnon desires. Achilles desires fame. At the very least, Odysseus wants this disarray to have some strategic significance. Because each person travels to Troy with a specific goal in mind, the campaign is riskier than it first appears. The Greeks lack a heart, but they do have a fleet. Achilles and his myrmidons set sail. This is not your typical squad. They don't appear to be individuals you can ignore. Instead of Agamemnon, they are passionately committed to Achilles. Patroclus, his young relative, is one of them. He admires Achilles and longs to be near the hero, not yet realizing that doing so could be fatal. Achilles is an inspiration to Patroclus, one of the few surviving attachments that Achilles still has to the human world is Patroclus. Here, the movie subtly starts getting ready for more suffering. Even as the audience witnesses the fleet's power, the weapons gleam, and the warrior's self-assurance, personal themes are already being interwoven. A common soldier's death will be considered a part of the conflict. However, if Patroclus is affected by the conflict, Achilles will also be affected, and his armor won't assist. The movie does not rush, but this will turn out to be one of the major turning points of the entire plot. It first demonstrates how individuals bring the moment that will eventually be referred to as fate closer. The Greek army's first task prior to Troy is to arrive on the coast. For Agamemnon, this marks the start of a major victory. It is the first indication that the Trojans are a real menace. Achilles sees it as a chance to demonstrate that he didn't come to wait for the kings to decide on the hierarchy of glory. He dashes ahead of the rest with his myrmidons. It takes more than just military valor for his ship to sail first. This is a declaration. Achilles will never come in second. The arrival in Troy is depicted as a living force striking the coast. Sand, shields, arrows, shouts, rushing bodies, everything appears to be a moment where a person can instantly become a part of the earth, rather than a tidy tournament of heroes. But in the midst of this mayhem, Achilles acts differently. He hardly ever loses his composure. His battle differs from a crowd's rage. He is dangerous, fast, and accurate. He seems to be able to anticipate his opponent's next move. The Temple of Apollo is the first significant target. It is a center of worship for the Trojans. It is a strategically important and iconic location on the coast for the Greeks. For Achilles, it's just another method to demonstrate that he has no fear of foreign sanctuaries, gods, or people. His myrmidons capture the temple, and the movie reminds us once more that mankind would not have gained freedom in absence of the gods. They merely replaced the actual destroyers. Achilles encounters Briseis, a Trojan priestess and royal family member, in the temple. Her appearance is noteworthy as the first real challenge to Achilles throughout the war, rather than as a random prisoner. He had previously viewed Troy as a platform for his glory. The side he came to eliminate is represented by Briseis. Unlike others, she is not afraid of him. She perceives him as both a killer and a hero. This is also unusual for Achilles. He's accustomed to being admired or despised from a distance. A person who does not respect the legend is standing in front of him. When the temple is taken, Agamemnon shows up as though he has won, and the old animosity between him and Achilles reappears. Agamemnon wants to take credit for the outcome, elevate his name above the risk of others, and demonstrate to the troops that everything is his doing. Achilles, on the other hand, finds it intolerable when someone who is standing behind steals the glory from the first person to fall under the arrows. The battle over Briseis is evolving beyond a simple disagreement about a prisoner. This is a power struggle. Agamemnon takes it away from Achilles in order to warn him that even the greatest warrior's award can be taken by the king, because he views Agamemnon as a greedy guy who takes advantage of others' power and conceals his wants beneath a crown rather than as a great ruler. Achilles takes this as an insult, and even before the big battles, this incident alters the war's trajectory. Achilles cannot bring himself to serve a man he despises. Even when he is capable of killing hundreds of adversaries, he declines to defend Agamemnon, even though many Greeks are still unaware of its scope. This is a catastrophe for them. The kings are self-assured, the navy is large, and the army is numerous. Yet the greatest fighter has already withdrawn from their conflict. Troy watches the enemy from its tall walls and gets ready for the reality that the city will be put to the test multiple times. Priam has faith in his sons, the walls, and the gods. Hector is a firm believer in self-control, caution, and the need to keep people safe. Paris thinks that if he is brave, his love can be justified. Helena starts to realize that, in the eyes of people who have done her no harm, her presence in the city has become both a source of terror and hope for a new life. This is the film's opening segment's strongest point. Troy doesn't begin with the city's collapse, the heroes' deaths, and the last legend of the wooden horse. It collects the reasons initially. One monarch desires dominance. One man longs to reclaim his humiliated pride. One young man desires unpaid love. One brother desires to keep the family intact. A fighter wants a moniker that will endure after death. And when these impulses come together at the gates of Troy, war is unavoidable, not because the heavens ordered it, but rather because individuals realize the consequences of their choices too late. However, an even more devastating blow is in store, because the true test won't start when the armies fight on the battlefield, but rather when Paris confronts Menelaus and everyone realizes that the man who started the conflict might not be the hero that the disaster he produced deserves. Paris enters the battle because he can no longer conceal himself behind words of love rather than because he has developed into a great fighter. He had already declared that he was prepared to die for Helen. Saying it in front of a brother, in a room, or on a ship is one thing, but walking between two armies when the Trojans, Greeks, father, brother, and the woman who started it all observing you is quite another. Menelaus takes up the task with a heavy confidence that stems from anger rather than nobility. For him, Paris is neither a young prince who made a mistake out of passion or a romantic rival. He is viewed by Menelaus as a thief, a young man who defiled him in front of all of Greece by stealing his wife. As a result, the combat immediately takes on a straightforward meaning. Menelaus regains his honor if he kills Paris, and the war appears to lose its primary motivation. This even appears to be a sensible idea at first glance. One battle with more than thousands of fatalities. The two individuals who ignited the fire make all of their own decisions. However, as Troy has already demonstrated, personal agreements are essentially meaningless in this world if there is a force nearby that pursues triumph rather than justice. It is not because he desires peace that Agamemnon consents to the duel. All he wants to do is see how the result can be applied. This moment becomes excruciating for the Trojans. Priam appears to be both a king and a parent. Paris appears to be willing to put his life at danger for a Helen. Hector appears to be a fighter who anticipates problems. He's the only one who truly knows his brother. He is aware that Paris may be true, attractive, and daring when he is passionate, but a duel with Menelaus calls for poise, strength, and combat expertise rather than passion, and there is hardly any of that in Paris. And as soon as the battle starts, the truth is revealed. Paris makes an effort to maintain his composure, maintain his dignity, and avoid embarrassing himself in front of the two armies. However, Menelaus confidently and violently presses him. He doesn't fight an equal in a duel. He punishes the man he feels is to blame for his humiliation. Every blow appears to tell Paris that a decision made at night can result in your death in front of everyone in the morning. That love cannot shield you from steel, and that beautiful words cannot take the place of martial prowess. Paris takes a rest. He sheds his arrogant disguise, stumbles, and crawls away. Furthermore, Menelaus' strength is not the most agonizing moment. That made sense. The most agonizing thing that Paris refuses to accept death at the pivotal moment, despite having vowed to die for Helen. He crawls over to Hector and seizes him. He's looking for salvation, not victory. The field appears to freeze at that point, because Hector has to decide between his brother's blood and the warrior's code. He's not permitted to intervene in accordance with the duel's regulations. Menelaus must either prevail or perish because Paris challenged him. However, Menelaus lifts his blade over a man who, to Hector, is both a younger brother and the source of the conflict. And Hector does what makes him a sad hero once more. He disobeys the law in order to uphold his own allegiance. Menelaus is killed by Hector. This is one of the best plot twists in the first part of the movie, since it neither turns Hector into a villain nor permits his behavior to be deemed pure. He violates the agreement by saving his sibling. He gives Agamemnon a new motivation while defending his family. He does a human deed that makes sense to everyone who has a close relationship, but from a political standpoint, it is disastrous. Paris is still alive. However, it appears that his salvation is nearly as bad as death. He didn't turn into a hero. He failed to show Helen that he was entitled, did not put an end to the conflict. Troy now owes his brother his life, and he has to make up for his frailty. When Helen realizes this, her love can no longer be the same romantic fantasy. She realizes that the man she left Sparta for was unable to endure the trial he had demanded. Nevertheless, the movie does not make her look disdainful. It is more painful than icy condemnation. According to Agamemnon, Menelaus' passing does not put an end to the conflict, but rather creates fresh opportunities for it. He can claim that the brother was killed unjustly, that the Trojans violated the pact, and that the Greeks must now exact revenge. However, the audience is well aware that Agamemnon would have looked for a passage to the walls of Troy even if Menelaus had prevailed. Simply said, the path is now more handy and louder. There will soon be a tremendous conflict. For the first time, Achilles' absence turns from a personal grudge into a strategic one. Although the Greek army is large, its power varies. It loses more than just the best combatant without Achilles. She misses the hit that shatters the opponent's self-confidence. Agamemnon intended to demonstrate that he could defeat Achilles and continue the conflict. The reverse is soon demonstrated on the battlefield. Many Greek leaders lack the gathered strength that Hector had to lead the Trojans. He doesn't simply charge into combat. He keeps the goal, keeps formation, and reads the situation. He doesn't crave fame for its own sake. Because there is a city behind him, he fights like a guy who cannot afford to lose. He's dangerous because of this. Hector bears the burden of a whole country. But Achilles may be more lethal in combat. The conflict demonstrates that the Trojans are not inferior to the Greeks and are occasionally even more disciplined. They feel that retreating does not just mean losing a position, because they are familiar with the terrain and can see the walls behind them. The enemy's route to their homes is known as retreat. As a result, each meter of the field has personal significance for them. The Greeks came for the king's orders, honor, glory, or loot. The Trojans represent the community in which their family reside. In this conflict, Agamemnon must confront a terrible reality. He can assemble kings, but he is unable to take Achilles' position. He can yell about his strength, but he can't turn into the man the opponent fears. His personal bravery is insufficient for the scope of the conflict he has initiated, and his ambition is excessive. Additionally, Achilles' empty space becomes more apparent as the Greeks fight on the battlefield. This is especially clear to Odysseus. He's not an idealist. He's aware that rulers frequently proclaim one thing, desire another, and use a third to pay for it. However, he also recognizes the reality of war. The Greeks would pay a far greater price if Achilles does not return to the battle. Odysseus does not attempt to make Agamemnon appear superior than himself. He only observes that an entire army can be destroyed by the rivalry of pride between the warrior and the king. Achilles is still in his camp at this point. On the surface, his refusal to fight seems like a whim. It is, in reality, a principle, albeit a nasty and arrogant one. He refuses to cede his authority to a guy who appropriates his honor and claims it as a royal right. However, this rejection has a negative aspect. Other people are dying while Achilles defends his honor. He sailed to Troy for glory, but he didn't want this battle for Helen. Now that his glory has been offended, he stands aside. Briseis is standing next to him. The tone of his line is altered by her presence. She's a prisoner at beginning. Then she starts talking to him in her way that almost anyone else does. She inquires about the soul rather than successes. She looks at his murderous hands and wonders whether there's more going on. Achilles is accustomed to people staring at him because of the legend. Briseis examines blood. In the movie. Their relationship is tense, but important from a narrative standpoint. Achilles is not merely softened by Briseis. She forces him to consider the subject he avoids. What is left of a person if their greatness is taken away? Is it a blessing or a misfortune if his name is known for his murders alone for thousands of years? Achilles doesn't directly respond, but he starts to grow tired of his own legend next to her. Briseis recognizes the paradox as well. This man arrived with an army of invaders, massacred her people, and defiled the shrine. However, he differs from Agamemnon. He lacks petty greed, but he is harsh. It's not dishonest, but it can be frightening. Talk of a holy battle is not how he hides. He behaves and speaks directly. And this directness is almost as alluring. It is terrifying. The movie skillfully creates a clash of worlds, rather than a conventional romantic relationship between them. Briseis has ties to duty, family, faith, and Troy. Achilles is associated with death, the sea, the sword, and the name. She stands for what he destroys. He stands in for the impending fire that is threatening her city. And the closer they become, the more the movie illustrates how, even in an epic conflict, the most perilous shifts can occasionally occur not on the battlefield, but rather in the dialogue between two individuals who were meant to despise one another. The Trojans gain confidence after a fierce struggle. They realize that the Greeks are not unbeatable. Hector gains much more significance for the city. He is more than a prince. He is evidence of Troy's resilience. However, the picture starts to intensify the tension at these very moments, because when one person becomes the support system for too many, everyone is at risk of losing them. Hector is not a victor who can unwind when he returns to the city. He's aware that the conflict is still in its early stages. He observes the happiness of the populace, but he is aware that the Greeks will not abandon them simply because they lost one day. Agamemnon has put too much money into the campaign to acknowledge a mistake. Even though Achilles is currently silent, he is too dangerous, and every new Troy triumph could simply fuel Greek rage rather than advance peace. The Trojan side's emotional focal point is scenes involving Hector and Andromache. Andromache doesn't think about glory or talk like a politician. She speaks as a wife who observes that her husband leaves the house every day and might not come back. Their bond gives the movie a sense of a true home that many other characters' relationships lack. A home where a youngster dreads his father's helmet and a lady longs for a living husband by her side rather than victory songs, not a palace, a kingdom, or a legend. Andromache is shown a covert route out of the city by Hector. Although this image appears realistic and even serene, it is actually more terrifying than many fighting scenes, because a guy who has faith in winning does not lead his family to safety. As a true defender, Hector must consider the day when the walls might collapse even though he wants to survive. Instead of saying, "I will definitely return," in this scenario, he expresses his love by bracing himself for the worst. With lovely hope, he doesn't lie to his wife. If he is gone, he provides her a chance to survive. Hector is therefore the movie's most developed hero. He shoulders the repercussions of this war, even if he did not select it. He is protecting the city where Helen was transported, not stealing her. He assassinated Menelaus in order to save Paris, even though he didn't want to violate the treaty. His name starts to resound with the respect that Achilles intentionally craves, even though he does not dream of immortal grandeur. Hector becomes great because he is unable to avoid his responsibilities, not because he wants to be great. Following his defeat, Paris looks for his role in this conflict. He is not immediately redeemed in the movie. He doesn't become an unbeatable fighter overnight. He is still a man who has to live in humiliation, and that's crucial. In a more straightforward narrative, Paris could have paid the debt with a single act of bravery. However, Troy is slow to extend forgiveness. His weakness was too costly for others to be erased by a single lovely deed. Helena is also evolving. She can now see more clearly that the city is burdened by her presence. She starts to feel a want to go, to vanish, maybe even to go back to the side where the trouble originated. However, her reappearance is no longer a solution to the issue. Agamemnon won't turn the ships around, even if Helen leaves the gates. The initial reason of the war has long since been outgrown, and this is one of the movie's most cruel lessons. Even though someone could desire to fix a mistake, the world has already found a way to use it for its own ends. After the failure, Agamemnon becomes even more dangerous. He is unable to acknowledge that he exaggerated his own abilities. Rather, he looks for fresh approaches to coercion, demand, and force. Fear and ambition, not respect, are the foundations of his power. He doesn't seem to be the campaign's spiritual focal point, even among the Greeks. He is not as intelligent as Odysseus. He is not as strong as Achilles. He needs other kings as if they were parts of a machine. However, he continues to believe that he is the master of history. For this reason, the battle with Achilles turns into a significant clash rather than only a military issue. Agamemnon desires that all the great men serve him. Nobody should be above Achilles' name. They both feel proud. They are both risky. In their different ways, Both are self-centered. However, Agamemnon frequently puts other people's lives in danger for power, whereas Achilles puts his own life in danger for glory. As a living example of how differently they view others, Briseis finds herself sandwiched between them. She represents Agamemnon's superiority and serves as a trophy that he might use to degrade his opponent. She's initially a part of the war for Achilles as well, but with time, she transforms into something more than just war booty. He starts to view her as a person rather than as a prize, even though Achilles doesn't believe it for a long time. This little alteration is significant since it demonstrates that he is still capable of changing. Briseis had the opportunity to murder Achilles in one of the pivotal scenes, not in combat, but in close proximity, where the sword and glory are meaningless. He is helpless in her presence. She also doesn't do it, not because she didn't remember who he was, not because she was forgiving of the conflict. However, I didn't anticipate seeing myself in him. This scenario serves as a subdued contrast to the massive conflicts, as kings order people to kill people they hardly know. Since closeness has destroyed the straightforward perception of the enemy, a person does not kill someone they have every reason to despise in this situation. After this, Achilles can no longer be the same myth. He is still dangerous, arrogant, and capable of terrible fury, but doubt starts to grow inside of him. Maybe life doesn't have to be about being remembered and feared. Perhaps there is more powerful than a song about triumphs. Although Briseis doesn't immediately respond, her presence forces him to ask the question. As the Greek camp becomes more tense, the Trojans debate their next course of action. Here, the movie depicts still another perilous feature of the ancient world. Judgments are made based on faith in science, priests, and omens in addition to military reasoning. Hector tends to think practically. He is aware that Troy's fortifications are its greatest asset, that the enemy is formidable, and that the open field is hazardous. However, not everyone is prepared to exercise prudence. When Troy wins a fight, it gives the impression that the gods are on their side, allowing them to advance. This is a very human error. People frequently use achievement as evidence of their own accuracy. The Greeks were repelled by the Trojans, allowing them to launch an assault. Hector, however, is aware that winning in a conflict does not guarantee success in the future, particularly when Achilles is present in the enemy camp. Even if he hasn't yet entered the battlefield, Agamemnon is also trying to figure out how to take charge again. He must demonstrate that the campaign has not failed. He must put pressure on Troy until the Greeks begin to have second thoughts. The conflict at the city walls is becoming a test of patience as much as weapons. The fissures on both sides grow increasingly noticeable the longer the siege lasts. There isn't a single moral core among the Greeks. Despite his authority, Agamemnon is disliked. Menelaus has passed away, and his motivation has disappeared. Achilles is not playing. Even though Odysseus sees the threat, he is powerless to stop everyone from acting foolishly. The Trojans have a city, a family, and land, but they also make mistakes. They believe that walls and gods would keep them safe from everything. They take pride in their victories, and they trust in signs. In light of this, Patroclus is becoming more and more determined to prove himself. When a great warrior is around, he is more than just a boy. He aspires to live up to the legend he grew up next to. However, Patroclus's perception of Achilles' exterior attributes glory, mastery, and the admiration of warriors makes this yearning risky. The inner value is still beyond his comprehension. For him, entering combat in armor, embracing the heroic persona, and emulating Achilles signifies discovering purpose. However, this already starts to sound like a sign of disaster to the spectator. Achilles makes an effort to stop him, instruct him, and mentor him, but he is unable to properly transfer the knowledge that can only be acquired via blood. He discusses mobility, technique, and survival with Patroclus. But how can you tell a young man that fire, rather than light, may be the glory he seeks? If Achilles hasn't given up on the path yet, how can we persuade him not to follow it again? The lines are progressively drawn into a terrible knot in the movie. Agamemnon must triumph. The Trojans start to think they can force the Greeks to return to their ships. Even if Achilles doesn't participate in the fight, his reputation is so tremendous that it affects what happens. Patroclus aspires to join the legend. Hector is prepared to protect Troy, but he is unaware that the next turn of events would not come from Achilles directly, but rather from the error of the person donning his armor. And because of this tension, Troy transcends its status as a movie about a historical conflict. It turns into a tale about how names start to exist independently of people. Even when Achilles is not engaged in combat, the Trojans are terrified of his name. Even though Hector is still a mortal man with a wife and child at home, the city benefits from his name. Even though the real cause of the war has long ago expanded beyond Helen's tragedy, her name is still referred to as the cause of the conflict. Paris's name equally conveys humiliation and affection. Additionally, the name Agamemnon is becoming more and more associated with power, which is never content with any triumph. The most difficult turn is still to come, though, because Achilles needs to return to the battlefield, and it won't find him through an edict, a plea, or a glory promise. The only attachment he hasn't been able to shield from his own legend will be the target of her attack, Patroclus. A man who continues to think that fighting might lead to grandeur, stands with Achilles for a considerable amount of time. He observes how the Greeks pronounce his name, how the Trojans are afraid of even the shadow of his armor, and how the Myrmidons gaze at their commander. It is a temptation rather than a curse for the young fighter. He believes that entering the battlefield, donning armor, and fighting valiantly will suffice, and he will also be included in this epic tale. However, the movie has previously prepared us for the idea that, in Troy, a foreign name is just as deadly as a sword. Despite his refusal to engage in combat, Achilles' legacy endures in the camp. He continues to represent power for the Greeks. He represents fear to the Trojans. Additionally, Achilles' absence becomes too significant as the conflict gets closer to the Greek ships and Agamemnon's army starts to perceive a genuine threat. At this point, Patroclus performs what appears to be a courageous deed, but it turns out to be a deadly error. He leads the Myrmidons into combat after donning Achilles' armor. From the standpoint of the battlefield, this virtually instantly alters the atmosphere. The Trojans are more affected by Achilles' return than by any order when they recognize the squad's attack technique, helmet, and armor. The Greeks find inspiration. The Myrmidons are keen to move forward. Even though Achilles hasn't left the tent, the fight starts to revolve around his name once more. The dreadful irony of the movie is found in the legend's ability to act without a human. However, it has the power to annihilate anyone who attempts to replace it. When Hector spots a figure engaged in combat, he assumes it is Achilles. This is more than just a fight with a formidable foe to him. This is an encounter with the individual whose presence has always loomed over the conflict. Hector is aware that killing Achilles will give Troy a chance to win both militarily and morally. The primary hero of the Greeks will be lost. Even the greatest immortal, as the Trojans will discover. Unaware that he is up against Patroclus rather than Achilles, he approaches the combat with utmost seriousness. Because of this ignorance, the scene itself is lethal. Patroclus is not killed by Hector maliciously. The young man is not being pursued by him. He battles the Greek warrior he believes to be the most dangerous, and it's too late when the blow is delivered and the helmet is taken off. Achilles is not in front of him. A young man who attempted to emulate him and died in his likeness is standing in front of him. Hector understands right away that it was more than simply eliminating an adversary. He knows that Achilles will now come back. For Agamemnon, no. For Menelaus, no. Not for Helen, not for the Greek king's alliance, nor for the treasures. He will come back to get retribution, and it is nearly difficult to prevent such retaliation. Instead of the triumph of a winner, Hector's face conveys the weighty dread of a man who has witnessed the opening of a future disaster. Achilles' most vulnerable aspect of his soul is struck by Patroclus' death. Prior to this, he could dispute with Agamemnon, brag about greatness, hate monarchs, and avoid the suffering of others. Every day, but more frequently as part of his profession, he encountered mortality. Now, a man from a foreign city, an adversary, or an anonymous soldier do not perish. He cherished, shielded, and, in his opinion, taught Patroclus how to survive. And it's not because Achilles has grown weaker that the myth of him breaks down here. Instead, he becomes even more terrible in his anger. Beneath this rage, however, is something else. For the first time, he genuinely recognizes the worth of the environment he has selected for himself. War will eventually claim more people than just your adversaries if you are a warrior. You have to do it yourself. In the same way that Patroclus died in Achilles' armor, if you base your life on an immortal name, someone you love might die under it. Achilles sobs, shouts, and collapses. Brad Pitt plays a man who has lost the only thing that has kept him near human sensitivity in these passages, rather than a chilly super warrior. Achilles had previously sought immortality through memory. Thus this is a significant turning point. He now views Patroclus's memory as a pain rather than a gift. He will remember him as a guilt rather than as a part of a melody. Achilles no longer has to be convinced by Agamemnon. Politics is no longer necessary, because there is less new suffering. The transgression is forgotten, rather than because it is forgiven. When Achilles rejoins the battle, he is no longer the same warrior vying for glory on Troy's shores. This man is moving in the direction of a single name, Hector. And the movie makes a pretty subtle step here. Even if Achilles only recognizes Hector after Patroclus's death, it does not make him a monster. The audience is aware that Hector did not want to use duplicity to kill the young man, because he was unaware of who was wearing the helmet. He served as the city's guardian. However, Achilles no longer cares about these justifications. The conflict is reduced to individual casualties. Furthermore, the reality of another person frequently loses significance when the suffering is so intense. When Troy learns about Patroclus's passing, he becomes anxious. Hector doesn't feel victorious when he gets home. Andromache believes that an irreversible event has occurred. She sees her spouse alive, but he already appears to be encircled by death. Hector is not afraid to comprehend. He is aware that Achilles will pursue him. He can hope for a relief from the conflict, the walls, the guards, and the night. However, he knows in his heart that he will be responsible for paying this obligation. Achilles shows up in front of Troy's fortifications in the morning, because it relies almost exclusively on sound and suspense rather than action. This is one of the movie's most memorable scenes. Calling Hector's name, he rides alone into the city in a chariot. Not the military, not the Tsar, not Troy, just Hector. Even though thousands of fates are on their side, the entire enormous conflict now turns into a struggle between two individuals. Hector doesn't go out because he believes he will win. He leaves because he is unable to stay within. He will temporarily preserve his life. He remains behind the walls, but he will lose what makes him Hector. Troy gives him a look. Dad gives him a look. The wife is aware of the situation. The boy is still too young to comprehend the horror of this situation, and in order to confront the person who has come to kill him, Hector, the man who valued protecting the house above all else, must leave the house. He talks to Andromache before that. The movie makes it very evident in these situations that while bravery may appear admirable on the outside, it frequently has cracks on the inside. Hector serves as a guardian for the city, for the legend-worthy foe of Achilles, a valiant warrior for the audience. However, Andromache sees him as the husband she could lose in a matter of minutes. Furthermore, no song of grandeur can take the place of a living person for her. Priam makes an effort to stop his son. He is aware of Achilles' terrible nature. At the gates, he witnesses fury. However, Hector has already decided. The standard survival rationale does not applicable in this situation. He cannot let someone else take accountability for his deeds. Even though he was unaware of the truth, he killed the person Achilles loved. Achilles is now entitled to insist that he leave, perhaps not the right to justice, but the right to blood, which is more powerful than many laws in the movie's society. The movie makes no effort to conceal the differences between Hector and Achilles when they meet in front of the walls. Achilles is nearly superhumanly calm, whereas Hector is courageous, strong, and experienced. His movements are unmistakable. Even his once beautiful arrogance has faded. He doesn't take advantage of celebrity. He arrived to complete the task. And that's exactly why the conflict is so terrifying. We witness a conflict between a guy who wants to survive for the sake of his home and a man who, following Patroclus' death, hardly cares what will happen to the world after retaliation. Rather than a sporting match of equal objectives, Hector demands a deal. The winner must give the loser person's body back to his people. It may seem straightforward, yet the body was extremely important in the arena of ancient warfare. Burial is more than a custom. This is the last boundary between man and prey, the last honor, and the last chance for the family to say farewell. Hector requests that this border be upheld. Achilles declines, and by refusing, he demonstrates how profoundly suffering has become him a weapon. An honest conclusion is not what he wants. He wants Hector to experience shame in addition to death. He wishes to deprive him of what he even attempted to provide his adversary. Achilles is dangerous right now not because he is stronger, but rather because his compassion has been burnt away by his sadness. The fight is plainly and brutally staged. Hector makes an effort to persevere, focuses on the present, applies his knowledge, and doesn't give up. He doesn't appear frail. But it's evident that Achilles is fighting at a higher level with every move. He's colder, quicker, and more accurate. The immortal name was spoken at the start of the movie for Achilles, even though Hector was the greatest warrior of Troy. And now that name is a death sentence rather than a lovely legend in front of him. The movie is not happy when Achilles murders Hector. There is no liberating sensation of victory. The walls scream, Priam's face, Andromach's hopelessness, Achilles' own emptiness, and quiet. He accomplished his goal. He exacted revenge. However, Patroclus did not come back. The discomfort persisted. As a result, the wing quickly proves to be insufficient and nearly lifeless. The most heinous thing Achilles does is tie Hector's body to his chariot and drag it in front of Troy's walls. There is no military need for this. This is an act of fury, not just at the deceased, but also at the city as a whole, which watches helplessly from above. Priam witnesses the transformation of his son's corpse into a symbol. Andromache witnesses how they even prevent her from fully grieving her spouse. Troy notices that its primary defender has been humiliated in addition to falling. Achilles reaches his lowest moral position at this point in the movie. Despite defeating the greatest Trojan, he seems to be lower than himself rather than greater. His retaliation became reasonable but not honorable. This is crucial because, despite his suffering, Troy does not elevate the hero. Cruelty is explained by pain, but it is not purified. Hector's body is still in the Greek camp. Achilles maintains it as a souvenir of his retaliation. But over time, the spectator senses that this body is now a silent accusation and other than a sign of victory. Achilles' ability to conceal his fury decreases with its proximity. The opponent protecting the house was killed by him. The deceased man who requested a burial was humiliated by him. He caused suffering for the child, wife, and father. Patroclus did not return as a result of all of this. When Briseis notices what is happening to Achilles, her eyes are crucial once more. He killed her city's hero, her kin, and her protector, so she can't just console him. However, she also witnesses his internal devastation. Their line becomes nearly impossible. Not only is the baffling general between them, but there is also the name of Patroclus, the body of Hector, and the suffering on both sides that cannot be expressed in lovely words. Priam arrives to Achilles' camp at night. After the huge battles, ships, walls, duels, and cries, the movie abruptly focuses on a tent, an elderly man, and a warrior, possibly the most powerful scene in the whole movie. Priam arrives before the enemy camp as a father who has come to request his son's body, not as a king demanding talks. There is more bravery in this deed than in many conflicts. He visits the man who killed Hector, defiled his corpse, and had the unprotected ability to murder Priam. Priam is portrayed by Peter O'Toole with such subdued intensity that the action is no longer merely a part of a historical conflict. He does not engage in political discourse with Achilles. As a father to a man who had a father of his own, he addresses him. He reminds him of aging, bereavement, and the reality that even an adversary may comprehend a son's love, and in doing so, he achieves what neither Odysseus, Agamemnon, glory, nor victory could. Instead of using power, he uses human suffering to penetrate Achilles' armor. Priam gives Achilles' hands, the ones that killed his son, a kiss. The meaning of this behavior is nearly intolerable. It doesn't involve humiliation for the purpose of humiliation. There is a depth of fatherly love within it. If it restores Hector's last honor, he's willing to bend before the murderer. For the first time, Achilles actually sees a man who has lost his kid instead of an enemy, the Trojan king, or a figure from the legend. Achilles has an internal breakdown. He weeps not just for Patroclus. He sobs, maybe for Hector, for himself, for all the lives that are reduced to names and corpses by conflict. A profound kinship of pain emerges between him and Priam in this scene. A cherished young man was lost. One of them lost a son. One was murdered in retaliation. The other came to ask for forgiveness. For a brief moment, the war, which appeared to be an enormous machine, comes to a halt in front of a straightforward reality. Every hero is merely a loved one to someone and cannot be replaced by glory. Hector's body is returned by Achilles. Additionally, he allows time for the funeral. This indicates that the individual within the legend has not yet fully perished, yet it does not invalidate his deeds or instantly render him pure. Achilles is left with the knowledge that his journey to an everlasting name is not just filled with triumphs once Priam departs with his son. It is covered in other people's cries, tears, and prayers for the deceased. The recovery of Hector's body causes Troy to experience widespread sadness. Not simply a fighter is lost by the city. The support that kept dread at bay is leaving him. Even the biggest dangers looked manageable as long as Hector was still alive. The walls are still there, but a gap is starting to form inside of them. The audience already knows that the city has lost a guy who knew the threat the best. Even though some may still think Troy is unbeatable. In the movie, Hector's funeral results in both grief and a final change in the equilibrium. Paris no longer has a sibling to protect him from the repercussions. Priam loses both the primary protector and an heir. Her son is left fatherless, and Andromache is left without a spouse. Helen loses one of the only individuals in Troy who viewed her as a living source of complicated misfortune other than a symbol. Even Achilles, who is on the opposing side, misses the final chance to see a straightforward route to victory in this conflict. Troy will never be the same after Hector's passing. There used to be a hero in the city who could confront the walls and rise to the occasion. Troy now depends more on time, stone, faith, and guile. Achilles used to be a warrior looking for a name that would last forever. He is now a man who has witnessed the price of that name through the eyes of the deceased enemy's father. Agamemnon used to be able to rely on pressure or force to get what he wanted. It is now evident that even if Troy's strongest defender is dead, it is difficult to take Troy by frontal assault. At this point, the movie starts getting ready for the last change. The conflict switches from using open force to using deceit. The walls of Troy remained intact while the heroes assessed their bravery. The city had the face of opposition when Hector stepped onto the pitch. However, Odysseus, a guy who recognizes that sometimes a city is vanquished by the most frightening thought rather than the sharpest sword, is becoming more and more prominent. The wooden horse, the Trojans' last era, the city's collapse, the demise of those who have already suffered too much, and Achilles' ultimate metamorphosis from a fabled murderer to a man who, in his final moments, considers the woman he wishes to save from the fire rather than glory are all ahead. However, the movie doesn't immediately arrive to this conclusion. There is a moment following Hector's burial that is more akin to holding one's breath before the last blow than it is to peace. Troy laments the loss of its protector. The Greeks hold off. Achilles appears to be pulling back from his earlier fury. Even though Agamemnon still desires the city, it is now obvious that merely hurling people at the walls and hoping for victory is insufficient. Hector's passing may have damaged, weakened, and rocked Troy, but its walls still remain. The war then takes on a new shape, while strength, honor, duels, and direct encounters determined everything in the early section of the story. Intelligence now takes center stage, the ability to force the adversary to open the gates themselves, not bravery, army power, or the title of the greatest warrior. This is Odysseus' domain. He is neither the loudest, the strongest, or the most conceited of the Greeks, but while others only see stone, he perceives frailty. He knows that a city that cannot be captured by force can be captured via hope, faith, and exhaustion. In the movie, the Trojan Horse is more than just a well-known mythological figure. He emerges as the culmination of all the errors made by both parties. The retreat is being organized by the Greeks. Their camp appears to be deserted. The ships vanish from view. A massive wooden horse statue still stands on the coast, seemingly as a gift, a sign, or an acknowledgement that the siege has ended. Such a symbol is too readily misinterpreted as freedom for those who have experienced death, terror, funerals, and the continual fear of an attack. And that's where the scene's dismal reality lies. The Trojans want to think that the conflict has ended. The city longs for relief rather than analysis after all that has transpired. People want to view the deserted shore, leave the gates, and breathe in the air free of Greek swords. They've lived too long under the shadow of death, so they want a vacation. Additionally, people occasionally neglect to look for a knife concealed in good news when they are so desperate for it. Paris is one of those who perceives danger. He didn't develop into a great warrior or a second Hector, but at the end, he shows signs of a more serious fear. He desires to set the horse on fire. This is a crucial point. The individual whose carelessness contributed to the war's escalation now recognizes the threat more clearly than others who previously appeared to be wiser. However, his voice is no longer powerful enough. Troy recalls his error, his failure in front of Menelaus, and his reliance on Hector's defense. Paris may be correct, but people who have already made a costly error are not always allowed to speak the truth. Weary from grief and battle, Priam interprets the horse as a portent. In his world, rituals, symbols, and gods are very powerful. Despite losing his son, he continued to believe in Troy's unique destiny, and this faith turns into the vulnerability, not because faith is stupid in and of itself, but rather because it takes the place of caution at that precise moment. Before a gift, Troy doesn't unlock the gates. In front of her own hope, which longs to come true, she opens the gates. The horse is transported to the city. This scene functions as a gradual approach to catastrophe. The heroes are not as knowledgeable as the audience. We are aware that the wooden figure conceals Greek troops. We know that the deserted shore is a show. We recognize that the city is commemorating the final hours before its destruction rather than a victory. The Trojans' happiness seems so weighty because of this. Future fire already envelops their smiles. Troy's celebration nearly appears like an effort to recover the previous existence. They laugh, drink, give thanks to the gods, and give each other hugs. They hope that after a protracted siege, ladies will no longer be horrified by the gates. Children will be free to run fearlessly once more, and the elderly will be able to talk about the war they experienced as a thing of the past. However, a massive, alien, and silent horse stands in the middle of the city. It seems to take in all the sounds surrounding it and bide its time till nightfall. Additionally, the movie changes from an epic to a nightmare when night falls. The Greek fighters get off the horse. The festival's quiet becomes a carnage. The gates open. The army comes back. It turns out that whatever Troy believed to be the end of the conflict actually began inside the walls. Compared to the fighting on the field, this terror is essentially different. The adversary was far away from the city. The adversary was standing outside. The house and the battle were divided by walls there. Waiting for conflict at the gates is no longer necessary. She's already in the streets, the temples, the hallways, and the rooms where people slept following the festivities. From the start, Agamemnon achieves his goals. However, the movie doesn't give his triumph any grandeur. He arrives at Troy as a man who has finally been granted access to the city, not as a liberator or a mere avenger for his brother. Because it is not supported by a just purpose, his victory is tainted. He doesn't bring about peace. For his selfish desire to grow, he is demolishing one of the most exquisite cities. The story started with Helen and Paris, but Agamemnon always saw walls, gold, and enslavement behind them. This is made abundantly evident at the moment of Troy's fall. In the metropolis, chaos breaks out. Homes are being broken into by soldiers. The streets are filled with fire. Metal smashing sounds blend with screams. The film depicts Troy as a virtually everlasting city, but its stone beauty turns into a trap, because there is practically nowhere to flee. The more magnificent the walls were, the more dreadful it is now inside. For a world that had thought itself rescued only that morning, the Greeks' victory turns into a night of devastation, rather than a magnificent conclusion. In the temple, Priam meets his demise. For him, this location ought to be the last line of defense, a site of sacred significance where even the adversary might pause. However, Agamemnon is not the type of man who can be stopped by a sanctuary. Priam's passing demonstrates how Troy's ancient world is disintegrating both literally and spiritually. The monarch, who trusted in omens, the gods, and the magnificence of his city, dies where he had thought to find his final sanctuary. Briseis' line reaches a pivotal point as she finds herself adjacent to this horror. She has already journeyed from Achilles' prisoner to the one who discovered his weakness. She is still a Trojan, nevertheless, with ties to the city, the royal family, and the people the Greeks are currently slaughtering. When she faces Agamemnon at the temple, his strength is met with a personal reaction. He's accustomed to taking cities, lands, women, glory, and the triumphs of others. However, Briseis is no longer merely a victim of his circumstances. She murders him. Within the creative interpretation of the story, Agamemnon's death is portrayed in the movie nearly as a historical reckoning. He died in the city he desired to conquer because he believed Troy to be the height of strength. In a time of turmoil, at the hands of a woman who, like him, was accustomed to receiving a portion of the spoils, rather than in an honest duel with the great king, on the field of glory, or to the chant of warriors. This provides the movie a crucial internal balance, but it does not lessen the horror of Troy's fall. The guy who started the power struggle does not come out on top. At this moment, Achilles had changed from the warrior who initially set foot on the shore in order to earn a legendary name. He doesn't go into the flaming city for trophies or Agamemnon. He wants to locate Briseis. This is when his inner journey comes to an end. The primary call no longer sounds like the glory he sailed across the sea for. He's searching for a living person rather than a song about himself in a collapsing city. Furthermore, Achilles is no longer only a good hero. His history does not vanish. The dead, the temple, Hector, the body by the chariot, Patroclus, retaliation, and pride are still behind him. However, he ultimately decides to take a course of action that does not immediately further his legend. To save Briseis is to take a chance for love, attachment, and the opportunity to do something that war does not require, even if only once, rather than for the sake of glory. Andromache is attempting to save the Trojans at the same time by using a secret tunnel that Hector had shown her. That serene moment between the husband and wife was crucial because of this. Even though Hector is no longer alive, his care is still ongoing. Even though he was unable to hold the walls, he was able to leave a route for those who had to survive. His real triumph is found in this, not over Achilles, not over the Greeks, nor over destiny, but over his home's total loss. Helen is headed towards salvation as well, because the movie does not portray her as the only offender. Her plot in the conclusion does not face harsh criticism. She became the pretext, the reason, and the symbol, but she wasn't the only destructive power. Like many others, she's now just another woman rushing among the flames. In the face of smoke, swords, and screaming, her beauty, which once made her the talk of the war, means nothing. She ceases to be a mythical character at that point and turns into a human who needs to survive. In the end, Paris is given the opportunity to at least do what he can now, rather than trying to fix everything, because it is not feasible. He aids his own, looks for a Helen, and attempts to portray himself as the final prince of the city who has nearly lost everything, than as a young man awaiting his brother's protection. The scene where he gives the youthful Aeneas the sword of Troy is very significant. It is more than an item. It is an indication of continuity, the statement that the people have a future as long as the sword of Troy is with the Trojan gives the movie a way out of the destroyed city. Troy collapses, yet does not entirely vanish. It is possible to burn stone. It is possible to pillage palaces. It is possible to slay the king. You may bury Hector. However, the people are not yet totally vanquished if someone takes away their memory, language, name, or symbol. The movie uses this sword to change the finale from total devastation to a sorrowful continuation. Achilles locates Briseis. Their encounter appears to be the final opportunity to save something from the battle amid the mayhem of the burning city. However, Paris is already close by with a bow. Paris views Achilles as the greatest threat, the person who killed Hector, and the one who caused him enormous suffering at home. Instead of seeing him through Briseis' eyes, he sees him through the eyes of a brother, a Trojan son who has lost his defender. Achilles gets struck in the heel by Paris's arrow. This is a well-known legendary image, but the movie makes it seem more grounded by eliminating the god's active participation. Achilles was shown as nearly unbeatable throughout, yet he wasn't shown as a magical entity that was truly unbeatable. And here is a man that even the most formidable fighters were unable to stop, who was fatally struck in the confusion of the city's collapse rather than in a spectacular duel. Not from Hector, not from Agamemnon, not in a glorious time. From Paris, the very hero who was formerly thought to be feeble. Paris shoots once more. Achilles sustains multiple injuries. At this point, the movie humanizes the legend's demise. To keep this mark visible, he removes the arrows from the body, but leaves one in the heel. Troy is blazing all around them. Briseis is close by. He no longer seems to care about the glory for which he once sacrificed a brief life. He orders her to go, not to remain with him, not to pass away next to him, not to transform love into a lovely tomb. He desires for her to survive. This may be the most subdued response to Achilles' entire adventure. He initially opted for death in order to have an eternal name. Ultimately, he comes to terms with death so that someone else can depart. There is a significant difference. He doesn't think about music in his last moments, but he will nonetheless become a legend. He considers Briseis. Therefore, his death completes an internal metamorphosis from a warrior who wanted the world to remember him to a man who wants his beloved to survive without him, rather than negating his prior brutality. The Greeks discover Achilles' body among the dead in the city they have taken. His legend is finished. He achieved the goal for which he sailed to Troy, an enduring reputation. However, the movie has already prompted the audience to consider if the cost was reasonable. Patroclus has passed away. Hector has passed away. Priam has passed away. Troy is on fire. Briseis moves through the flames, and if Achilles' name endures, it will do so not just as a brilliant brilliance, but also as a reminder of the devastation this glory endured. The survivors are shown in the last moments. Through a covert route, Andromache, Helen, Paris, Briseis, and other Trojans depart. In the traditional sense, this is not a victory. The city was not saved by them. They didn't exact revenge on everyone. Hector was not given back by them. However, they preserve life, which the Greek army was unable to eradicate. This turns into the only viable method of resistance against the backdrop of Troy's demise, the idea that he is fortunate to live in the era of great men is expressed by Odysseus. He talks about Achilles, Hector, and the heroes who will live on in history. His voice lacks the straightforward happiness of a conqueror. Instead, it is the emotion of someone who recognizes the scope of what he has seen. As thousands of anonymous people perished in the city's fires, he saw the city's fall, its grandeur and insanity, and how the greatest fighters became part of history. Troy completes its major loop here. Achilles first had to decide between a long, calm life and a brief, beautiful one. We can tell that he genuinely attained greatness in the end. However, the movie prevents this from being seen as a genuine reward. It turns out that the name's immortality is a heavy echo, where other people's screams may be heard, rather than a bright sky over the hero. Hector is given a different kind of memory, the memory of a guardian who faced conflict for the city's benefit, even though he did not desire it. Priam continues to be seen as a father whose love overcame royal authority. Even in its ruins, Troy is still alive thanks to the people who fled the flaming walls. The city suffered a physical defeat. In symbolic terms, it hasn't entirely vanished, because the film ends with the survivors' movement rather than ruins. The sword in Aeneas's hand, the secret entrance, and the departure of Briseis, Helen, and Andromache all indicate that the story doesn't stop when the winner raises the flag. Sometimes the real story leaves by a side door into the shadows, with a memory that cannot be erased, but without the music of victory. Now that the plot has been resolved, it is crucial to examine why this specific adaptation of the ancient myth became a significant Hollywood event in 2004, why some audiences praised it as a potent epic drama, why others disagreed with its loose interpretation of the source, and why Brad Pitt's portrayal of Achilles is still one of the most iconic on-screen representations of the ancient hero. Achilles' death brings an end to both his personal narrative and the film's central argument about glory. He first opted for a brief life because he thought that death would not fully prevail if the name outlived the body. However, Troy ultimately demonstrates that having an immortal name does not absolve one of the expense. Conversely, the more suffering that surrounds a name, the louder it is. Achilles becomes a true legend. People will remember him. However, the audience recalls more than just the duel with Hector, the landing on the coast, and his jump onto Boreas. We recall how he bemoaned Patroclus. By the chariot, we recall Hector's corpse. We recall Priam kissing his son's murderous hands. In the last moments, he tells Briseis to go, and we remember that. For this same reason, Achilles is not directly exalted at the conclusion. It simultaneously makes him wonderful and tragic. Paris's shooting of Achilles had a complicated conclusion as well. It is simple to hold him accountable for nearly everything at the start of the movie. He took Helen to Troy, hid behind Hector, lost the duel with Menelaus, and saw too late how big of a mistake he had made. However, he is not made the protagonist by the conclusion. He does not become the new Hector, nor does he win the war or preserve the city. His action is significant in another way, by dealing a blow to a man he would not be able to defeat in a fair battle. He serves as a reminder that in actual conflict, legends frequently fall short of their own expectations, attracted by both his love for Briseis and his desire for fame. Achilles dies in a burning city among turmoil rather than in the arena of glory. His last scene is especially harsh because of this. He succeeded in his goals, but he passes away at a time when he could have made a different decision. His mother once informed him that he had two options: either a brief life, to which his name would be remembered for ages, or a long, silent life devoid of honor. He went down the second route. In the end, though, the film asks whether he realized late that life was more than just the recollections of other people's lives, rather than whether the decision was the right one. Briseis departs. Additionally, the fact that Achilles does not insist that Helen accompany him in death makes her departure noteworthy. Women frequently become a trophy, a cause, a prize, or a symbol in mythological epics. Briseis experiences the peril of being all of this in the movie, but ultimately she finds a way to go toward life. She fails to return Priam, save Troy, and stop Hector from dying. However, she makes it out alive. Furthermore, surviving becomes a distinct kind of victory in a movie where men so frequently choose fame, power, and battle. Helena departs from the burning city as well. At this point, the movie at last releases her from the mere role of the offender. Yes, the war might not have begun exactly that way if she hadn't eloped with Paris. However, a detailed examination of the story reveals that Agamemnon was waiting for a purpose. Menelaus sought to regain his lost honor. Paris desired carefree love. The monarchs want power, and the heroes desired notoriety. The dry forest was already there, but Helen was the spark. In the conclusion, she's portrayed as a woman entangled in the web of someone else's aspirations and her own error, rather than as the legendary beauty for whom hundreds of people died. This is one of the more subdued yet profound endings in terms of significance, as Andromache guides the survivors down a hidden tunnel. Even if Hector is no longer with us, his carers still act, because he knew that a true protector must consider both victory and what would happen after defeat. He showed his wife the route ahead of time. This shows that Hector is more powerful than the concept of heroic glory itself. He didn't simply pass away gracefully. He gave others who shouldn't perish with him a chance. After being given to Aeneas, the sword of Troy begins to represent memory. History continues even after the city collapses. This is a spiritual continuance rather than a tangible triumph for the Trojans. The devastation remains incomplete as long as someone bears the people's sign, as long as someone remembers, and as long as someone survives the fire with both their body and their name. In this way, the conclusion of Troy emphasizes that no triumph can completely usurp the memory of the vanquished rather than the Greeks' victory. Agamemnon, on the other hand, has a modest conclusion. He desired to be remembered as the monarch who subjugated Troy. However, neither a noble death nor a sense of a destiny ruler is left for him in the movie. Briseis kills him, which appears to be a reaction against the fundamental tenet of his authority. He saw war as a path to fame, cities as trophies, and people as instruments. However, he is ultimately stopped by a guy who such power is accustomed to disregarding, not by an army or a great hero. Odysseus continues to have more knowledge and experience than many. His concluding remarks regarding the era of great men sound more like a somber acknowledgement than a call to action. He witnessed the fall of the city, Achilles, Hector, Priam, and the cost of cleverness, which he himself contributed to. Even if Odysseus triumphs intellectually, it doesn't appear to be a clean victory. Although the wooden horse is a clever tactic, it also serves as a tool for the destruction of the city at night. The movie doesn't make us despise Odysseus, but it does remind us that in combat, the mind can sometimes be more dangerous than physical prowess. In a nutshell, Troy does not finish with good triumphing over evil. This is not a straightforward scheme at all. The Greeks prevail militarily, but Agamemnon's avarice, the savagery of the attack, and deceit tarnish their moral triumph. Despite losing the city, the Trojans are able to retain their human dignity thanks to Hector, Priam's love, Andromache's care, and the survivors' rescue. Achilles receives an immortal name, but it comes about as a result of his loss and subsequent insight. Paris is still alive, but he has to live with the fact that his love nearly destroyed the city. For this reason, the movie leaves a strong aftertaste rather than a feeling of heroic victory. The world was not saved by the wonderful people we witnessed. Despite being the greatest warrior, Achilles was unable to defend Patroclus and enjoy the life he may have realized too late. Despite being Troy's greatest defender, Hector was unable to protect the city from both his family's faults and foreign cunning. Priam was a fine king, but the wooden horse persisted despite his faith in omens. Paris and Helen fell in love, but careless love was the start of a catastrophe. This is Wolfgang Petersen's version's strongest point. He presents the old tale as a human play in which the gods are not actively involved. In the realm of classical mythology, The gods frequently influence heroes' fortunes, lend assistance to some, trick others, lead conflicts, and provide explanations for odd developments. Nearly everything in the movie is put on human shoulders. As a result, the narrative becomes both vast and, in a way, more harsh. You can no longer claim that the heavens intended things to be that way. Admittedly, this is what the people wanted. The director of Troy, Wolfgang Petersen, has experience working under duress and on a massive scale. The way the image retains space, the sea with ships, the city walls, the area in front of Troy, the temple, the Greek camp, and the night fire reflects his experience with major studio pictures. Everything is designed to make the viewer feel both the weight of the large universe, where a single choice can turn into a historical disaster, as well as the individual scenes. The Trojan story and the Iliad serve as the basis for David Benioff's script, which drastically reorganizes the content to create a Hollywood drama. The movie streamlines events, modifies character outcomes, eliminates the gods' direct involvement, and blends several themes into a more seamless on-screen story. As a result, Troy cannot be regarded as a faithful adaptation of Homer's writings. This is exactly a cinematic portrayal, with a distinct emotional arc: love, cause, campaign, siege, duel, revenge, deception, and downfall rather than scholarly authenticity as the primary goal. There have also always been discussions about this choice. Some spectators enjoy the movie because of its scope, actors, music, Achilles and Hector's duel, Troy's portrayal, and the sad conflict that makes sense. Some criticize it for simplifying the myth, eliminating gods, altering the protagonist's destines, and making the old tale more alike to a major adventure film from the early 2000s. However, the picture has endured because of this very contradiction. It is talked about as both an adaptation and a distinct rendition of the myth, which for many became the first significant Trojan War depiction on screen. As Achilles, Brad Pitt develops the character via more than just physical conviction. His Achilles is fast, nimble, and nearly predatory in combat, but his pauses are more crucial than his blows. In the disdainful way he regards Agamemnon by the sea, he listens to Thetis, how he transforms beside Briseis, how he overcomes Patroclus's body, how he doesn't say anything to Priam. The movie progressively reveals that his Achilles' apparent coldness is actually armor rather than emptiness. For many viewers, Eric Bana's portrayal of Hector became the movie's genuine center. His character is the most morally unwavering, but not the most notable in terms of legendary grandeur. He makes mistakes, particularly when he violates the pact by saving Paris, but practically all of his actions are motivated by a feeling of duty. He doesn't want to go to war, he doesn't like killing, and he doesn't envision conquest. He defends the things he cherishes. The audience doesn't want either of them to die, but they understand that one must fall, which is why the confrontation with Achilles is so effective. Paris is portrayed by Orlando Bloom in a way that makes the character's annoyance intentional. He is attractive, passionate, and sensitive, yet it is precisely these qualities that make him dangerous. He is a man of emotion in a world when immature emotion can wipe out a city. Diane Kruger's portrayal of Helen provides the movie a picture of a woman who is transformed into a symbol by everyone, even though she is becoming more and more aware of the horror of this symbolic role, particularly in the moment where he visits Achilles at night. Peter O'Toole's portrayal of Priam adds a melancholy old grandeur to the movie, in order to show the audience that great conflicts are frequently motivated by the desire for power rather than ideas. Brian Cox presents Agamemnon as tough, powerful, and almost unpleasantly earthy. The film's visuals play on the impression of a vast, ancient universe. Costumes, armor, ships, sandy beaches, enormous gates, palaces, and the climactic flames combine to create a complex and tangible story rather than a historical textbook. Here, it doesn't matter how correct each detail is from an archaeological perspective. What counts is how it contributes to the impression of a society in which every action is visible to the public. Every combat is seen by the walls, and every slain hero instantly becomes part of the memory. James Horner's music has a significant influence on perception as well. It sustains a sense of foreboding throughout the movie, not just to accompany the conflicts. Even though Troy has a lot of amazing scenes, the soundtrack keeps reminding you that this isn't a celebration of violence. Even gorgeous shots frequently hint at an imminent defeat. As a result, the fall of the city at the end does not become an allure for devastation. It is seen as a lament for a world that discovered too late that hope may be deceiving. At the box office, the movie became a huge success. Ancient conflict, size, love, treachery, heroes, and the destruction of a great city were all clearly promised to the public in this costly epic movie, with a huge celebrity at its center and a sizable multinational cast. Although there was a significant worldwide box office, opinions were divided, and this perfectly captures the essence of the movie. Achilles at the gates, Hector in front of his family, Priam in the tent, the wooden horse in the joyous city, the arrow in the heel, and the sword of Troy in the hands of the next generation are just a few of the powerful images that have kept Troy in viewers' memories despite its flaws as an adaptation and a historical epic. The film's central thesis is that individuals who initiate conflicts seldom own it. Helen and Paris consider love, Menelaus considers honor, Agamemnon considers power, Achilles considers glory. However, once the conflict breaks out, it becomes uncontrollable. Hector, who was reluctant to initiate it, must do it. Priam, who wished to have faith in the city's defense, is taken by her. It requires Patroclus, who aspired to be a hero. Achilles, who believed he could trade life for immortality, is taken. And even the survivors depart with memories rather than triumphs. As a result, Troy functions as more than just a narrative about a historical battle. The movie explores how pride, power, and an excessive number of sword-wielding individuals may turn individual aspirations into historical disasters. On the harmful nature of unresponsible love. Without humanity, that fame is meaningless. A person may become famous as a result of that obligation, but they are not always saved by it. And that if hope is introduced, a hope that no one dares to test, even the tallest city may fall. Who won is not the last trace of the movie. Troy was captured by the Greeks, but they don't appear content. The people of Troy go with the sword and their memories, even though Troy has fallen. Although the audience is well aware of the cost of this fable, Achilles lived on and became a legend. Despite losing the combat, Hector maintained a higher level of dignity than many winners. In the midst of the smoke, the sea, and the departing survivors, the movie conveys a straightforward message. Even if a city burns down, a hero is killed, or a body is buried, history endures because someone still remembers what it was all for. Stay tuned to Screen Trace for more in-depth reviews that include plot, details, facts, and an explanation of the conclusion. Here, we examine films so that, even after the last scene, there is still a memory of the frames and an awareness of the impact this story has left on the viewer. You may readily recall the ships, armor, walls, duels, and wooden horse if you simply view Troy as a magnificent military show. But as it becomes evident that all of these outward symbols are effective because human error resides beneath them, the film's actual strength becomes apparent. Greek might is not limited to ships. A single queue at sea represents thousands of judgments. Along with soldiers, every ship also transports people's avarice, bitterness, ambition for fame, and obedience to commands. Troy's walls serve as more than just an architectural barrier. It is the city's confidence in its distinctiveness and in the power of stone, kings, and gods to avert catastrophe. The wooden horse is more than just a ruse used by Odysseus, because those inside the walls fervently hope that pain will end. It's a trap that succeeds. Furthermore, Achilles is more than just a hero in this system. He is a live example of the question: what happens to a person who bases their entire life on one desire to be remembered? This ambition looks almost grandiose at the start of the movie. Achilles has a deeper understanding of death than most people. He doesn't fool himself with assurances of contentment and tranquility. He is aware that the name might endure, but the body, strength, and beauty will all vanish. This has a horrifying honesty. However, the movie progressively demonstrates how a name devoid of affection turns icy. As Achilles strives for glory, Patroclus dies next to him, Hector dies, Priam suffers, Troy collapses, and Briseis turns into his final opportunity to feel a living connection rather than a reward. He ends up getting exactly what he desired, but it is no longer useful to him. He rose to fame at the precise moment when the narrative's protagonist realized that a single legend was insufficient. The lack of active gods in this retelling of the tale is its most intriguing feature. According to the traditional interpretation, the Trojan War would be nearly impossible without heavenly intervention. The gods choose favorites, interfere in conflicts, love, envy, aid, and hurt. However, the movie eliminates this obvious heavenly process, and as a result, the ground is held solely responsible. Paris can no longer claim that love was merely a heavenly mandate. Agamemnon's victory cannot be concealed by a higher will. Achilles' path cannot be explained by prophecy alone. Priam's trust in omens is insufficient justification. Individuals choose their own actions and refer to the series of their actions as fate. Because of this, Troy appears more contemporary than it actually is. The storyline in front of us is old, but it makes a very clear point. Catastrophes frequently result from the confluence of multiple personal wants rather than a single malevolent intent. Love is what one desires. The other seeks retribution. The third one wants authority. The fourth one aspires to be famous. The fifth wishes to keep the family safe. The sixth wishes to think that the city is unbeatable. Every desire can be comprehended on its own. When combined, they become a conflict. In this regard, Hector is the most tragic since, although he is unable to break free from the system of obligation, he is the one who is most aware of the cost of what is occurring. He could denounce Paris, but he couldn't cease being a brother. He was aware of the peril of engaging in open combat, but he was unable to resist the king's and the city's demand. Despite his desire for peace, he was unable to leave Troy. His moral convictions drive him to make hard choices. As a result, Hector's demise is seen as the point at which Troy's rational side perishes before the city itself, rather than as the usual loss of a hero. In contrast, Paris lives longer than the laws of the heroic epic dictate. It also has a horrible logic to it, because the movie shows him the repercussions. His weakness is not instantly punished. He goes through humiliation, Menelaus's and Hector's deaths, his father's fall, and the city's fire. He has the opportunity to live not as a winner, but as a person who will be remembered. In these kinds of stories, sometimes the penalty is not death, but rather life after the devastation you contributed to. At the core of this memory system is Helen. Her name has long since come to represent the beauty that sparked the cultural conflict. However, the movie skillfully diverts the audience from the overly straightforward charge. Helen is not in charge of the navy. She has no desire to invade Troy, and she does not give the order to burn the city. She makes a personal decision, but guys in her immediate vicinity repeatedly use it as a platform for their own goals. And this is a really true detail. Women are frequently blamed by society for problems, while, in reality, the problems are exaggerated by those who stand to gain from having a cause. As a result, Eleanor's redemption does not seem to be a full rehabilitation as she departs through the secret passage in the end. She is not innocent in the traditional sense. However, she is also not a perfect source of evil. She is someone who ended up within a fire because she wanted to escape one cage. She did not fire the city herself, but her beauty did not save anyone. She turned into a mirror through which every man might see his own. Paris love, Menelaus possession, Agamemnon a reason, Troy risk, the audience the tragedy of a symbol who was not permitted to be simply human. Another female line that is equally significant, but quieter, is Andromache. If Helen is linked to the start of the conflict, Andromache is linked to its aftermath. She doesn't go to the battlefield, give political speeches, or take part in important decisions. However, the movie illustrates the real price of bravery via her. Hector is seen by the warriors as the city's defender, a magnificent Trojan for a history, for Achilles a good foe, for Andromache, who loses her beloved husband due to the war. The movie demonstrates that compassion may live longer than grandeur when she guides viewers through Hector's prepared journey. A name is left by Achilles, a route is left by Hector, and for the living, this route might be more crucial. Centuries later, listeners of the songs find solace in the moniker. Those who travel through the smoke at night are saved by the road. In this additional meaning, Briseis serves as a conduit between the opposing sides of the conflict. Through her, Achilles first perceives Troy as a world of people rather than a goal or a stage for glory. She has ties to the city, faith, the temple, Priam, and Hector. Achilles is not merely stepping over the line between adversaries when he falls in love with her. He starts to realize that the side he is killing is real. Faces, voices, pride, fear, and pain are all present. And that's exactly why his decision to save her, in the end, becomes so important. He rescues his last human emotion from total servitude to battle. But he does not save Troy. If seen after the movie's conclusion, Agamemnon serves as a symbol of unbridled power. He's not the most adored, the strongest, or the wisest. However, he's the one who understands how to use other people's emotions as a political weapon. He needs Achilles' skill, Menelaus' grievance, the king's ships, Helen as a cover, and Troy as a prize. In this way, he's frightening not because he does evil once, but rather because he continuously exploits the motivations of others to further his own agenda. His reasoning is symbolically refuted by Agamemnon's death at the hands of Briseis. A man who saw humans as a resource dies at the hands of someone he may have thought was a weak player on the fringe of the big game. As a result, the movie re-establishes identity in a situation when authorities saw nothing but an object. Agamemnon's internal arc is closed by this death, even though Troy is not saved. Although he came to the city in search of victory, the city ended up being the site of his reckoning. Odysseus is unique. He's not as skilled in combat as Achilles, and does not appear as filthy as Agamemnon, but the gates of Troy are opened by his mind. Additionally, the movie conveys conflicting emotions about him. On the one hand, he finds a solution where force has failed and rescues the Greeks from the never-ending siege. However, this solution results in the city being destroyed at night. Troy makes no claim about the immorality of the mind. However, it demonstrates that when the mind is used for military purposes, it can produce a kind of violence that even the strongest barriers cannot stop. For this reason, the wooden horse is terrifying not just as a military ruse. When employed against exhausted people, he is a terrible sign of trust. The Trojans weren't merely in error, they wanted to think it was over, and this goal turned out to be the path to disaster. This has a very human bitterness to it. When hope arises too soon and forces us to abandon caution, it can sometimes be hope, than fear, that destroys us. Troy conveys the idea that a person can be both magnificent and guilty but at such a conclusion. Despite his greatness, Achilles is guilty. Although Hector is a good man, his choices have repercussions. Priam is compassionate and wise, although he makes mistakes because of his faith. Paris is destructive yet sincere. Helen is not free to choose, but she is miserable. Despite being living, Briseis bears the memories of the deceased. No major character leaves the narrative unharmed. The movie is still talked about because of this, not because it makes no contentious choices, nor because it accurately recounts the original text. However, it transforms myth into a series of human repercussions. Everyone achieves their goals here, but very few achieve their dreams. Achilles is honored, but he passes away before he can truly care for Briseis. After receiving the city, Agamemnon dies there. Paris loses Troy while gaining Helen. Priam continues to believe, but he observes how faith may become a trap. Hector protects his honor, but he is unable to protect his life. Another feature of the movie is that it doesn't offer the audience a simple way out. It's not enough to blame Paris alone. It's not enough to simply blame Helen. Achilles cannot simply be admired or rejected outright. It is impossible to look at Hector and not think that even a nice man would end himself in the wrong fight. Troy reminds you of both the winners and the cost that they would rather forget. The conflict between Achilles and Hector is, of course, the sequence that centers the film's emotional recall. Achilles' death is significant for the legend, the fall of Troy is significant for the conclusion, and the wooden horse is significant for the storyline. However, all of the story's major themes, glory, duty, retaliation, terror, family, spectacle, and death, come together at the battle in front of the walls. Achilles and Hector are two poles up until this point. Despite living under opposite laws, they are both the finest fighters on their respective sides. Achilles is practically independent of the government. He hates Agamemnon, leaves the fight on his own initiative, and returns when his own suffering overcomes his pride. Hector, however, is inextricably linked to everything. He had ties to Troy, the army, the walls, his father, his wife, his kid, his brother, and the heir's name. Because he is held by virtually nothing, Achilles is terrifying. Because he is very attached, Hector is fantastic. The movie does not portray their encounter as a straightforward battle between equal champions. Indeed, both are powerful. Indeed, both are deserving of legend. However, their objectives during the battle are distinct. Achilles desires retribution. Hector desires to assume accountability. With the agony turned into a weapon, Achilles advances. Hector leaves with the knowledge that there are others behind him who require at least one last act of bravery. As a result, the audience senses this even before the first blow. For Hector, it is the final service to the city, and for Achilles, it is a personal blood due. The fact that there are onlookers in the movie around the moment is another reason it works. The Greek warriors, Priam, Andromache, Paris, and the Trojans on the walls are all observing. This isn't a covert murder. It is death on show for the populace. Hector is putting more than his life in danger. He passes away in front of the people he helped. Achilles is not merely looking for retribution. He demonstrates to Troy that its greatest protector is mortal. As a result, every blow has two meanings, symbolic and physical. The film's visuals highlight how lonely the area in front of the walls is. To people in the middle of a vast field and a massive city, this is almost empty after the scenes of thousands of fighters. However, the viewer recognizes that sometimes a city's fate really boils down to a few meters of land between two swords. Therefore, this emptiness is greater than the crowd. Myth recalls faces, not army lists. Not because the other people are unimportant. Nevertheless, the movie does not allow us to overlook the anonymous. Ordinary soldiers are continuously losing their lives in the conflicts surrounding the principal characters. Although their names are lost, and they don't have monologues, their deaths provide a backdrop that makes the heroes seem too perfect. An anonymous person perishes close by while Achilles pursues renown. Someone follows Agamemnon's orders and perishes at the wall when he demands Troy. Ordinary families are the first to perish in the fire when the Trojans celebrate a fictitious victory. The film is based on the major characters who speak for the narrative. Because of this, the battle sequences in Troy are more than just a dance display. Every significant conflict serves a dramatic purpose. Achilles' first triumph over Boreas illustrates the scope of his legend. The landing on the coast demonstrates that, if he can achieve glory first, he won't wait for someone else's command. The romantic hero's frailty in the face of the true cost of action is exposed in the fight between Paris and Menelaus. The fight becomes a personal grudge after Patroclus' death. Troy is internally shattered by the combat with Hector. The carnage that follows the wooden horse at night demonstrates how cunning and devastation have replaced the valiant period of open combat. The way the movie handles the heroes' bodies after they pass away is also crucial. Anger is sparked by Patroclus. Following his demise, Hector is humiliated before being begged for forgiveness. Achilles' body rests among the fallout from the city, yet he becomes a legend after his death. The dead corpse always speaks louder than words about the living. The movie evaluates a person's humanity based on how they handle a deceased adversary. When Achilles pulls Hector's body, he fails this test. However, when he gives Priam back Hector's body, he partially transforms back into a human. Priam passes this test in a different way because his love for his son outweighs his royal dignity, and he is prepared to touch the murderer's hands. The Trojans experience a funeral as a result. Hector's honor can be restored, but they are unable to vanquish Achilles, and this honor becomes the final bulwark before the actual fortifications collapse. Despite not being a warrior or a strategist, Priam is one of the most significant characters in the movie in this regard. His strength is his capacity to see people, even in situations where combat requires him to see only the adversary. The straightforward route of enmity is broken by the nighttime visit to Achilles. Priam does not extend forgiveness lightly. He doesn't claim that the pain of Hector's passing has subsided. He takes it a step further and admits that the person in front of him is a human being with the capacity to recall a father and comprehend grief. After spending a few minutes in the tent, a place appears where the conflict is still going on, but people are already talking over it. This scene is especially significant for Achilles because, alongside Priam, he first transforms into a son who recalls his own father rather than an image for others. Up until that point, he had been headed in the direction of fame, glory, and a death that would be turned into a song. Priam returns him to his family, to the old age he will never experience, and to the personal connection that glory continually robs him of. As a result, Achilles is not merely being merciful in this scene. He briefly sees the complete life he gave up for the mythology. In terms of the movie's structure, Briseis fulfills a comparable role from the opposite angle. Achilles' recollections of family and death are restored by Priam. The prospect of love is returned to him by Briseis. She doesn't immediately soften him. She doesn't make the murderer a saint. However, she is slowly shifting his eyes. Achilles is accustomed to viewing the world as a place where people may make their mark. He learns from Briseis that it is possible to lose someone in the world. And in the conclusion, this is really apparent. Achilles seems to be defying his own prior beliefs when he goes across the flaming Troy in pursuit of Briseis. He used to want everyone to stare at him. He must now locate one individual within the smoke. He used to want his name to live on after death. He now cares about her surviving tonight. The ultimate tone is altered, yet his past is not erased. Instead of shouting about himself at the end of his legend, he begs Briseis to go. In the end, the movie accomplishes nearly the exact opposite with Paris. He seems weak for a long time, because he is unable to rise beyond his emotions. He doesn't know the city, but he wants Helen. He can't tolerate Menelaus, but he wants to be courageous. He makes other people pay for his desire to live a nice life. Ultimately, however, his behavior is no longer purely motivated by romantic love. When he shoots Achilles, he has the instinct for Troy's survival, safety for Briseis, retribution for Hector, and protection for the survivors. He's still not Hector. However, he is no longer the Paris who, in front of the troops, crawls to his brother. However, the movie smartly refrains from making him a true hero. Since it's too late to do that, he can perform a significant deed, but he cannot change the course of events. Rather of abruptly elevating the persona, it is more truthful. Paris continues to be contradictory, weak, loving, guilty, alive, and capable of late bravery. It doesn't seem like he has an easy off-screen future. Elena is taken away by him, but he also takes with him the memories of the city that made their love possible. As someone who is not permitted to wrap up the narrative with a single explanation, Helen plays a significant role in extra final shades. She's frequently reduced to being the reason behind the conflict in myth and popular memory. The movie attempts to bring back our anguish and quiet. Despite its lack of military might, it has options. It's not malicious, yet there are repercussions. She is neither a saint nor a demon, A society where a woman of royal privilege, if her really belongs to herself, collided with her desire for freedom. In this way, Troy is still a movie from the early 2000s, yet it has enough contemporary flair. The spectacle is still constructed around legendary names, big wars, and macho heroes. However, individuals whom war seeks to marginalize, Briseis, Andromache, Helen, Priam as a parent, and Patroclus as a young man who aspired to be a hero, often raise the most pressing moral issues. Through them, the film continuously returns the suffering of a particular individual to the pathos of war. The contrast between indoor scenes and open areas visually supports this. The heroes become symbols on the battlefield. They revert to human form in tents, apartments, temples, and hallways. There is a legend about Achilles on the shore. Beside Briseis, Achilles is a man who is unsure of how to handle his tenderness. Hector is a guardian before the army. Next to Andromache is Hector, a husband who worries that he may leave her a widow. Priam is a king sitting on the throne. In Achilles' tent, Priam is a parent in need of a son. As a result, the picture stands out for both its scale and the way it alternates between intimacy and scale. Troy would turn into a protracted war movie without any internal suffering if there were just fights. The feeling of myth and historical significance would vanish as there were merely discussions. However, it is precisely this transition from wall to room, from ship to face, from army to body, from name to person that produces the sensation that keeps people watching the movie. Upon closer inspection, it is evident that Troy is not about the clever capture of a single city. It describes how each character in the novel attempted to cling to something unique. Power is Agamemnon. The name is Achilles. Hector is at home. Love, Paris, Helen, liberty. Priam, sons and faith. Andromache, family. Briseis, honor. Odysseus is a logical solution to a dilemma. However, nearly everything that individuals attempt to cling to is either destroyed or drastically altered by battle. This is exactly what gives the movie a human aftertaste in addition to a magnificent one. We can debate whether scenes should have been developed differently, how successfully the gods were eliminated, and whether the adaptation was accurate. However, it's difficult to dispute that the film's central fight involves more than just Achilles and Hector. It occurs between the need to stay human and the aspiration to be great. Years later, it is evident that the film's primary legacy is not in its accurate portrayal of the ancient source. Because Troy produced vivid, expansive, emotionally readable imagery, it has endured in the minds of viewers. Achilles, sprinting toward the giant's direction. On the horizon is a massive fleet. In front of his son, Hector took off his helmet. Paris crawled over to his brother, Priam, going inside the enemy's camp at night. The wooden horse in a city already commemorating its own downfall. An arrow to the heel. Covert passage. The sword, departing with the surviving. These pictures function virtually independently of mythological discussions. It is possible to be familiar with the Iliad and disagree with the movie. You can sense the tragedy, even if you have no idea where it came from. This is the power of a great popular myth on screen. It may serve as a gateway to the old text rather than taking its place. For many audiences, this movie was the first realistic portrayal of the Trojan War, not as a classroom narrative, but rather as a story of people who made errors, loved, feared, and perished. The movie can, of course, be criticized. It makes the plot more grounded and simple by drastically changing the original contents, condensing events, and reshaping destinies. The unique ancient intricacy where humanity and skies are connected vanishes without the gods, which is why some people miss them. Some believe that Hollywood has turned the age-old tale into a huge commercial success. The amorous line between Achilles and Briseis is disliked by some. Some like less smoothness, more old horror, less recognizable studio shape, and more historical roughness. However, the fact that the movie has discovered its own voice remains unaffected by these criticisms. It makes no attempt to be an archaeological record for the contemporary audience. He aspires to be a sad spectacle, and he makes perfect sense in this role. Look at how love turns into a pretense, which turns into a war, which turns into a siege, which turns into retaliation, which turns into destruction, and which turns into mythology, he says. An understanding of ancient Greek culture is not necessary for the viewer to be struck by such a sequence. It functions because comparable human pride mechanisms are comprehensible across all historical periods. The fact that neither side is given total moral purity in the movie is particularly intriguing. The Trojans protect their house, but their error with the horse proves to be lethal. The Greeks triumph, but their triumph is marred by destruction, deceit, and greed. Achilles might be brutal, but he is a great fighter. Although Hector is a good man, saving Paris violates the agreement and starts a fresh round of violence. Priam is compassionate and smart, yet his trust in the sign turns into a vulnerability. Paris is a passionate lover, but his honesty kills. Helen wants to be free, but it turns out that other people's corpses are all around her. There is no comfortable position for the observer in such a universe, which makes it unpleasant. It is impossible to take a side and feel totally justified. Even if you support Troy, you can still see Paris, Priam, and the council's errors. You still recall Hector's body. If you are an admirer of Achilles, you can still see how Agamemnon makes use of Menelaus's rage if you comprehend it. Even if you have sympathy for Helen, you are nevertheless affected by her decision. The movie consistently makes you think about two things at once. Even if someone is understandable, their actions can still be harmful. In this way, Troy is more about the price of human desires than it is about the tale of right and wrong heroes. Additionally, practically every character makes exact payments for the things they value most. Power is paid for by Agamemnon. Achilles is willing to pay for fame. Paris for immature love. Priam for blind faith. Hector for duty, which proved to be more burdensome than a single life. Helen for the hope of liberty in a society where her liberty was quickly turned into a political tool. Briseis for being a part of a city that was torn between foreign aspirations. Andromache, because the fear of becoming a widow constantly coexists with love for the city's guardian. What's left over after the Great War is the film's core question, not in songs, not in chronicles, not in the winners list, but in reality. There are still names after her. However, names are more than just fame. Achilles is a beautiful and terrifying name. Hector is a name that connotes both failure and dignity. Helen is a name full of reproach and yearning. Both love and humiliation are associated with the name. Paris, greatness and ash are associated with the name Troy. Every name turns into a container where wine and light are combined. The final sword is crucial because of this. It is about the reality that memory does not entirely belong to the winners, not about conquering the Greeks. The survivors carry a different history, while the winners may write their own. They recall not just the fall of the city, but also its way of life. They recall Hector as a spouse, father, son, and protector rather than as a vanquished foe. They remember Priam as a man who went to the murderer for the sake of his son rather than as a dead monarch. They recall Troy as a home rather than as Agamemnon's plunder. Because of this, the conclusion is not as depressing as it could have been. Indeed, the city has burnt. Indeed, the primary defenders have perished. Indeed, the Greeks won the war. However, there is movement throughout the movie. The story will go on as long as people continue to walk. The emblem remains intact as long as the sword is removed. The last point does not become utterly silent as long as Andromache guides her son, as long as Helen and Paris disappear into the night, and as long as Briseis remains alive. This is not a pleasant ending, but it is one in which life fights total extinction. Achilles, however, has the most contradictory result. The movie genuinely goes above and beyond to make sure the audience remembers him, because he wanted to be remembered. However, much than just the ideal hero survives in memory. What's left is a person who was too magnificent for everyday existence and too vibrant for Achilles mythology. He had love inside of him. Therefore, he couldn't just turn into a monster of war. But because blood followed him, he couldn't simply become a savior. His screen power arises from this conflict. Hector is granted immortality in a different way. His grandeur appears purer, since he did not choose glory as a goal. Instead of enhancing his reputation, he wished to safeguard the house. He wished for his son's survival, his wife's safety, his father's avoidance of seeing the city collapse, and his brother's avoidance of dying due to his own stupidity. Not everything could be saved by him, however, because he continues to be a man of duty rather than desire until the very end. He becomes the moral center of the movie in the eyes of the audience. As a result, even after numerous viewings, the conflict between Achilles and Hector still has resonance. There, two fighters and two dreams about life's purpose collide. Achilles desires for his reputation to endure beyond death. Hector wants the people he loves to live through the conflict. In combat, one prevails. In the audience's recollection, the other frequently prevails. Furthermore, its contradiction outweighs any straightforward response. Troy also demonstrates that epic tales seldom conclude where the conflict does. Priam is still grieving after Hector's passing. Achilles is still furious when Patroclus dies. The runaways are still around after Troy falls. Achilles' name endures after his demise. The story endures despite all the successes and failures. And whether future generations view these events as a human tragedy or just a military map will depend on the narrative. Maybe that's why the movie still seems like a fantastic movie in spite of the issues. It is simple, yet it is not meaningless. Navigating the myth as though it were a clear emotional road is helpful. The temptation comes first. Next, the justification. The walk came next. Next, pride. Next, blood. Then retaliation. Then forgiveness. Then dishonesty. Next, fire. Then recollection. A framework like this is nearly old in and of itself, since it serves as a reminder that although human stories change throughout time, and with different costumes, the anguish of losing one's home, the fear of being forgotten, and the longing to be loved never change. There won't be a single response to the question of what Troy was truly about after the conclusion. This movie tells the story of a conflict that started out of love, but was driven by power. In the end, the hero's goal was to save another person, but he also desired immortality. About a defender who maintained his dignity while losing the duel. About a city that was destroyed by both the enemy's might and its own optimism. About those who discovered too late that, on occasion, a person's passion can cost thousands of lives. After the painting, such a mark is left, not a sense of little victory, not only melancholy, and not merely appreciation for heroic struggles. There is still a deep realization that human suffering is the source of tales, and that sometimes the heavier the shadow behind a legend, the brighter it is. Achilles was given a name. Hector was given a memory. Ashes and the sequel were given to Troy. And the audience is presented with a tale in which triumph does not make up for defeat. Love does not absolve everything. Glory does not prevent death. And the real significance frequently belongs to those who were able to rescue at least a sword, a kid, and a memory of home from the flames, rather than the winners. Stay tuned to Screen Trace if you're looking for such in-depth, lengthy assessments that examine the film's interior effects on the characters in addition to its events. Here, the story doesn't finish with the last frame. Instead, we examine what comes next.